Stanford University.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to all those who are watching on live cast. I am Professor Harry J. Elam, Jr., the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Stanford. And this thank you. And this program is the last major event in our year-long OpenXChange initiative, designed to initiate and expand thoughtful conversations about pressing issues of the day. From discussions about race and criminal justice, to climate change response, to immigration and foreign policy, our goal has been to think critically, to consider difficult issues respectfully, and to engage collectively in a variety of communities across Stanford and beyond. Over the course of 1 year, some 7,000 people, and that includes faculty, staff, students, and greater Stanford community and beyond, have attended events as part of OpenXChange. In addition, another 2,000 people have watched either on live cast like today or on post-event webcast. And we are most thankful for all of your participation in OpenXChange. We are particularly grateful for our campus event co-sponsors, and some of our most involved co-sponsors are listed in your program. Tonight, our guest is renowned global journalist Fareed Zakaria. Fareed is host of CNN's award-winning international affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS. He is a Washington Post columnist, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, and a New York Times bestseller. In 1999, Esquire magazine called him the most influential foreign policy advisor of his generation. In 2010, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 10 global thinkers. In his important book, In Defense of Liberal Education, Zakaria does just that. He makes a vigorous and impactful defense of liberal education and writes in the conclusion, quote, "Because of the times we live in, all of us, young and old, do not spend enough time and effort thinking about the meaning of life. We do not look inside ourselves enough to understand our strengths and weaknesses, and we do not look around enough at the world and history to ask the deepest, broadest questions. The solution, surely, is that even now we could all use a little bit more of a liberal education." And certainly that notion of a liberal education is important to us at Stanford today. Tonight, in an address titled, quote, "America in a New World," end of quote, Fareed will focus on the role of the United States in a world of increasing turmoil and polarization. Fareed will entertain questions after he speaks, and you can come to the mics that are in the hallway, in the aisleway. And please keep your questions brief so we can get to more questions in the short time that we have. And also, we ask after tonight, please continue the conversation in your dorms, in your dining halls, in your community centers, also with friends and family off campus. And so now, will you please join with me in welcoming Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harry. It's a huge honor and pleasure to be here. For most of us nowadays, I suppose the only way you can get to Stanford is to be invited for a couple of hours. They shuttle you in, they shuttle you out because you're not admitting anybody anymore. So this is the best I can do, and I'm grateful for it. It's a huge pleasure to have this chance. I also want to thank all of you for taking time out to come and listen. You could be at home or in your dorms watching the greatest reality show in American history, which is the presidential election. I certainly don't think, I have not in my lifetime seen anything more entertaining and perhaps more important, but certainly more entertaining than this. I think, we all look back on history and we remember the rhetoric more than anything else of presidential campaigns, and the early inaugurals and things like that. And You have the ringing words of John Kennedy, ask not what your country will do for you. Franklin Roosevelt, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And I sometimes think to myself, what will people remember from this campaign? Well, perhaps it's that moment when the Republican frontrunner was accused of having a small penis. And he was outraged at that because he thought it was factually inaccurate. And he pointed out in words that will surely live in history, I guarantee you there is no problem there. You need the hand gestures to get the complete effect. For free equal time, one has to talk about the Democratic race, but it's really so boring in comparison. It's at CNN, we know once you start covering the Democratic race, people are they're asleep already. Bill Maher had the best line about it, I thought. He looked at the Democratic race and he said, Hillary, we are trying to make this as easy for you. You know that, don't you? The last time we put you up against a black man with the name Barack, and whose middle name was Hussein. This time, we're running a 74-year-old socialist Jew against you. How much easier can we make this, right? But you've taken time out from all of this fun and games to listen to me tonight, and I'm very grateful. When I started doing this kind of thing, a friend of mine, George Will, who used to debate with me on the ABC television show This Week, he said to me, you're going to go out speaking, make sure you have a point. And I said, well, of course, I've got several points. He said, no, that's too many. You got to have one point. So I said, how specific does the point have to be? He said, well, I'll tell you a story. Conrad Hilton, the founder of Hilton Hotels, was on the old Johnny Carson show. Now, for the students in the audience, Johnny Carson is the guy who preceded Jay Leno, who is the guy who precedes the host of The Tonight Show. So you were in, dinosaur age history. Conrad Hilton's on the show. They have a pleasant chit-chat, and at the end of it, Carson says to him, Mr. Hilton, you've got all of America watching. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion? And Conrad Hilton, very elegant man, leans into the camera and says, why, yes, Johnny, I do. And he looks straight into the camera and he says, my fellow Americans, please remember, the shower curtain goes inside the bathtub. So, if you owned as many shower curtains as Conrad Hilton, you probably would make that your central message. I do not have a message of such specificity. I'm going to range a little bit more wildly, more broadly, and we'll see where it goes. What I thought I'd talk about is just the state of the world today. And what most people think of when they think of the world now is it's falling apart. It's deeply dangerous. We are in imminent danger of some kind of terrorist attack. There's so much of an emphasis on the negative, on the violent, on the unpredictable, that most people, when asked this question in the United States, are convinced that we are living through very deeply dangerous times. Well, there's actually very good data on this. The University of Maryland has a center that tracks it. And in point of fact, we're living in times of unusual political stability and peace. There's been a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years, but broadly speaking, over the last few decades, what you have seen is a large-scale reduction in political violence, by which one means war, civil war, and yes, terrorism as well. So that is the reality. But it doesn't feel like that, and it doesn't feel like that because you have these highly dramatic incidents of terrorism emanating out of one particular place in the world, and that's the Middle East. And so it's important for a minute to just understand what is happening in the Middle East, why it is in fact huge, deep, profound, but how to put it in some context as well. So if you looked at the Middle East, I don't know, from say the last 4 decades, you'd have looked back 4 decades ago, and the Middle East looked very stable. It was extraordinary, actually, how stable the Middle East was, in the sense that the regimes that were in place were unchanging. Now, they were stable because the Middle East was run by a series of highly repressive dictatorships, from Syria through Libya. If you think about the whole North Africa, all the way into the Middle East, these were all, whether it's Assad in Syria, whether it's Mubarak in Egypt, whether it was Gaddafi in Libya, these were all effective dictatorships. They also happened to be, for the most part, secular. And they repressed all forces that threatened to disrupt their societies. And the result of that, of course, is you had stability, but enormous stagnation. And as demographic changes, economic changes, political changes start to transform the rest of the world, the Middle East stays completely stagnant. So imagine the world of the 1990s, when you have communism cracking and crumbling in Eastern Europe, where you have the juntas of Latin America, and Latin America was run by a vast series of dictatorships, all yielding to democracies in some form or the other, for the most part. In Africa, you begin to have 40 or 50 elections in the decade of the 1990s, many of which were free and fair. In the Middle East, nothing is changing, right? If you were a young man in the Middle East in 1995, for the most part, you could say that the Middle East had actually regressed, that it was less economically, politically, and socially free than it was in 1955. And that reality meant that there was going to be some give, and you began to see it in various ways, and of course, it comes to fruition in the Arab Spring. And what that represented in some ways were these forces, demographic, technological, economic, political, pushing up against this old encrusted order. The United States invasion of Iraq, for better or worse, was another crucial destabilizing factor in destabilizing that old order. But here's the interesting thing. When that old order cracks and the regimes topple, what we discover is something quite unusual and something very few people predicted. You got rid of the guy at the top. It was all guys. And it turned out there was no state underneath him. There were no institutions that could maintain political order in these countries. And then you look below the political institutions and you discover there's no civil society that can maintain social order underneath it. And then you go one step further and you discover in many of these places there's actually no country. What I mean by that is when you got rid of a Saddam Hussein, what you discover is there's no state, political chaos, anarchy ensues, and people start in that political vacuum retreating to identities that they feel comfortable with, identities that they feel will give them some sense of security. And those identities are not the national identities that were created 100 years ago this week by Britain and France after World War I in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Those identities, Iraq, Syria, were created by the British because the Ottomans lost the war. They had to do something with the empire. What people retreat to are their older identities, much, much older. Kurd, Arab, Shiite, Sunni, these are 1,000-year-old identities. And those identities turn out to be the most powerful organizing forces in the Middle East, not the nation. And so you go from Saddam Hussein running a seemingly stable country to a point where it is difficult to find an Iraq anymore. I mean, you ask yourself, is there anybody in Iraq who is actually fighting for Iraq? The Kurds are fighting for Kurdistan. The Shia are fighting for their control of Shiistan, as it were. Many of the Sunnis are fighting for ISIS. Who is fighting for Iraq? You could ask the same question in Syria. You could ask the same question in Yemen. You could ask the same question in Libya. And so that is the nature of political instability in the Middle East, which is the entire project constructed after World War I that drew these national boundaries out of the old Ottoman Empire has begun to fray, if not collapse. And in that turmoil, what you have found is one of the great organizing devices has been political Islam, radical Islam, call it what you will. And that is then getting it in its own way energized by the very chaos. In that mix, I tend to believe it is very difficult to imagine that an outside intervention that will be able to stabilize this part of the world in a secure, permanent fashion. To put it another way, the idea that the United States from 6,000 miles away would be able to figure out what's going on in Syria, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, make sure that the good guys win, and then make sure that they stay good guys after they have won, is a very tall order. And as you can see in the repeated efforts that the United States has been involved in, from Iraq to Afghanistan, it is difficult to imagine that this will work out well if we were to take this big leap forward that so many people think we need to do. Another way of putting it would be to think about it this way. The United States toppled the government in Iraq, intervened, had 200,000 international troops there at their peak, and spent, $1 trillion trying to create a stable Iraq. The result has been chaos and violence and terrorism. The United States intervened in Libya, toppled the regime, but then stayed back and let the local forces try to do the nation building and modernization. The result has been political chaos and violence. The United States blessed the transition in Yemen, but did very little else. The result has been political chaos and violence. And the United States has not intervened in Syria, and the result has been political chaos and violence. There's some other variable at work here than the United States' actions, right? And I think it's the better part of wisdom here is to understand how deep and transforming these political changes are, and how unlikely it is that the United States from 6,000 miles away will be able to stabilize it in some turnkey fashion. But ask yourself this question. If I had told you 5 years ago that this was what the Middle East was going to look like, that Iraq would have broken down, that Syria would be in flames, that Libya would have essentially disappeared as a country, that Yemen would be in civil war, and I had then asked you, what would the price of oil be? Right? People would have said $200 a barrel. In fact, lots of people did. Why? Because the price of oil is, in a way, the single biggest reflector of instability, genuine substantive instability in the Middle East. So why is it that, in fact, what happened was all this instability rose and the price of oil actually went down? It's a simple way of illustrating a very important point. There's a lot of stuff going on outside the Middle East that is more important than what is going on inside the Middle East. The Middle East is a very small part of the world, and it actually, in economic terms, certainly, does not have a very large impact on the world. This statistic is from a while ago, and you'll see why, but it captures the reality, which is, if you look at the merchandise exports of the Middle East, that is to say, what they make, not oil, the merchandise exports of the entire Arab world were equivalent in a good year to the merchandise exports of Finland. Right? So in other words, Nokia in a good year was producing more product than the entire Arab world. That's the reality of the Middle East. It is not economically consequential, except in the production of oil. And of course, in that respect, things are changing dramatically. So the big shift that's taken place with oil is two great changes. The first has been the increase in American supply, and the second is the decrease in Chinese demand. American supply has gone from 20 years ago, America made a million barrels of oil a day. We now do 9 million barrels. Think about the percentage increase. The United States will next year, I think, be the largest producer of liquid hydrocarbons in the world. On the other side, you have Chinese demand, which has slowed down for all kinds of reasons that you know. But those are the two great forces that have had an impact on the price of oil. Increase in American supply, decrease in Chinese demand. The fact that Yemen or Libya is more or less stable one day or the next has turned out not to matter as much. And there's a broader story here, which is the story of what has been going on in the world is a story that is really about these much larger forces that are changing the world. And the two great forces changing the world right now are globalization and technology. They have been the drivers for the last 25 years, but they continue to be so. So if you look at the world from the perspective of globalization, I grew up in India. The India I grew up in was completely closed, autarkic, and really cut off from even basic information that you would imagine would be easy to get access to. When I was growing up in India, we had one television channel when I was 10 years old, black and white. It would show TV for about 4 hours a day, and it was mostly documentaries about the glories of Indian agriculture, which meant nobody watched it. And so you had, on Sunday nights, one Bollywood movie, and at the end of it, before that, they would give you one piece of imported entertainment. And it shows you how poor India was. What they could afford in 1978 or 79 was one 30-minute episode of I Love Lucy. This is from the show from the 1960s. So that was our window into the United States, which was a 20-year-old sitcom once a week, 22 minutes. Compare that to your knowledge of the world today. If I compare that to what is going on in India today, it's mind-blowing. And that reality of a much more closed, hermetically sealed world was true everywhere. People forget, but currencies that we now think of as routinely convertible were not convertible. The French franc was not convertible. The Italian lira was not convertible. The world was much more cordoned off. And that begins to change with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the collapse of communism. And you get this extraordinary reality that everyone starts to play the same game. Everyone starts participating in the same global economy. It's a very, very different world than one that had existed for decades and decades and decades before. And that is the world we are now living in, where we think it is normal for all these countries to be participating, trying to attract the same investment, trying to produce the same goods, trying to go after the same markets. That reality has become the defining feature of the world we live in. You can see it very simply in the data. So if you look at 1979, before this world count comes about, the number of countries that are growing at 3% a year is about 30, 32, 33, depending on how you count it. The number of countries growing today at 3% a year or more is above 80. In 2007, before the financial crisis, it was 125. So you've something like triple the number of countries, maybe in a good year, quadruple the number of countries that have managed to navigate this new world, raise incomes, maintain some degree of political stability. And that is the real story of what has happened in the world over the last 20, 25 years. It is not the story of Al-Qaeda. It is not the story of ISIS. Those guys will get a few paragraphs in the history books, but the reality of a China that went from being literally the poorest country in the world. I don't know where this is coming from, but let's hope it gets taken care of. A China that goes from a per capita income of about $200 to now being the second largest economy in the world, 10 to 15% of global GDP. That is the transformation of the world that's taking place. And these countries have now risen to a point where no matter what, they have become new participants in the global system. And you can see this everywhere you go. It's not just Asia, though it's true in Asia, but you go to Latin America and you see it in Latin America. You go to Africa, you see it there. And there are ups and downs. Brazil is doing badly now. Indonesia is doing well. But the basic trend to remember is that 25 years ago, emerging markets, so-called emerging markets, made up under 5% of global GDP. Today, they make up 45% of global GDP. That's the big story, what I call the rise of the rest. That is what has changed the world in this last 25 years more than in the last 250. And that continues, and that in many ways is accelerating because so much of it is happening in terms of the connections between people at the level of ideas, information, travel. These are things you can't really stop by putting up a wall here or a border there. The trend strikes me as ineluctable because it is so bound up now with human consciousness, with technology, and all of it persists. The second big trend, of course, is the information revolution. And I'm going to be hesitant to say very much about technology at Stanford, other than to point out how recent this reality is. You know, we forget now, but if you go back to 1990 when the Berlin Wall came down, the cutting edge technology of the day was the fax machine, right? I mean, if you think about the world that you live in now, the tools you use, smartphones, iPads and tablets, laptops, even desktops, the internet barely existed in 1990 as a mass phenomenon. I don't know if you remember this. There's the original Wall Street, the movie with Michael Douglas in it. My son and I were watching it the other day, and at one point, Michael Douglas, this investment banker, walks out of his East Hampton beach house to make a phone call. and he picks up the device to make a phone call, and my son says to me, it looks like he's calling in a drone strike. Because the cell phone of the age was so large and unwieldy and cumbersome that, today, I mean, maybe the president needs something that big. The truth is he probably doesn't, right? And that's only 1990, right? That's only 20 years ago that we had these extraordinary, we had a world that was not nearly transformed by all this information as it is today. In 1991, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, I remember an American official telling me the story at the time, which is, so when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, the country that gets completely scared out of its mind is Saudi Arabia, which is right next door. Because if Saddam Hussein has gone into Kuwait for the oil, well, Saudi Arabia is right next to it, and that's where the mother lode is. So all the tanks have to do is keep driving for a half hour, and they get to Saudi Arabia. So they're trying to figure out, do we call the Americans in? Do we not? We're a socially conservative country. Should we be doing this? And the king decides, and the king is 85 years old and not in good health. And basically, that's almost like written into the Saudi constitution, that the king will be 85 years old and not in good health. So he says, let me take a little bit of time to think about it. Don't tell anyone. So for 1 week in Saudi Arabia, it was a state secret that their next door neighbor had been invaded by Iraq. Imagine, in today's world, how long something like that could stay a state secret, right? 2 minutes? I mean, because you've got Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, CNN, BBC. You've got websites that would post it immediately. You've got phones. Once you have a phone, if you remember what the original formula for Twitter was, you were meant to answer the question, what are you doing right now? So all somebody would have to do in Kuwait was tweet, I'm being invaded by Iraq. And that's the end of this huge monopoly of information that the Saudi government had. And that's a very important part of what makes governments work. In the 1930s, when a rebel group would take over a government capital, they would take the presidential palace and the radio station, because you wanted control of the political power and control of information. In the 50s, they would take the presidential palace and the TV station. Today, what would you take, right? Because information used to be given out as a one-to-many system. Today, every node of a networked system has almost equal power. And so you could transmit, broadcast, tweet the information out from anywhere. And it becomes much, much more difficult to figure out where power resides in terms of the control of information. So those are the kind of changes that the information revolution has produced. And it's only going to keep accelerating, right? So that the phones that you have in your pockets and that some of you are quietly looking at, the phones that you have about as much power as NASA's computers that took man to the moon and back times 100. That's about as much power as what you have in your phone, in your pocket, is basically a supercomputer. It is about the power of a Cray supercomputer from the 1980s. And that's every single person, right? That reality has just begun to be applied, and you see it in big data, and you're going to see another great leap forward with regard to machine learning and neural networks. So we're just at the beginning of what the application of this incredible computer power means to the information age. Now, let me tell you what one of the consequences that people haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly in a place like Silicon Valley. And I tell it to you by telling you this statistic. If you look at the American economy from 1945, there's if I had a chart or a PowerPoint, this would be the only thing I'd put on. I don't believe in them because a guy in the military once said to me, please don't use PowerPoints. People who do rarely have any power and they never have a point. So I decided to myself, okay, I'm never going to use PowerPoint again. But if you look at American recessions and recoveries from 1945, they go like this. From 1945 to 1990, the economy recovers, gets back to its pre-recession level, then the jobs come back to their pre-recession level. So economy gets back, then unemployment comes back to the same numbers they were before. And that lag between when the economy recovers and the jobs come back has been about 6 months. And the mean and the median are about the same. It's not very different. It takes 4 months, 8 months, but it's basically been a short time period. 1990, that pattern is broken. The recession of the 1990s, the economy comes back and the jobs come back not 6 months later, 15 months later. The recovery of 2000, the economy comes back, and then the jobs come back not 6 months later, not 15 months later, but 29 months later. And in our last recession, the economy came back, and the jobs came back not 6 months later, not 15 months later, not 29 months later, 60 months later. So that suggests that something happened around the 1990s that broke the connection between economic growth and employment in a way that it hasn't really mended. And what is it? And I would argue it is these two forces I've just been describing, globalization and technological change. These two forces have been acting like a pincer movement. Now, if you have capital, they're fantastic because it means you have extraordinary access to the world. You can find places that have low interest rates to borrow from. You can find places that have high GDP growth rates to sell into. You can find trained populations you can employ. You can find pools of capital you can access. And you can play this great global arbitrage game. But if you are an average guy or an average person living in an advanced industrial economy, you face these same forces with a reality that you can't arbitrage a lot of them. You're stuck in this high-wage, high-income country, and the jobs can go, the robots can take the jobs away, and what are you supposed to do about it? And that, I think, is the underlying condition that we have to recognize about the world we are living in. And this, I think, is going to be the kind of fundamental challenge we face going forward. It's not ISIS. It's not the easy answer to this, of course, is to look outside, but it is something deep within us that we have to figure out, and it's not going to get any better. So we're living in the land of Google, so think about Google cars. Amazing, right? If you think about what it's going to do, these cars have been driving for hundreds of thousands of miles. They seem to be doing really well. And you can imagine 20 years from now, people will look back and think, how crazy were we to entrust something as dangerous as driving to human beings, right? I mean, you think about it. The driverless car never gets drunk, never misses a turn, it's never too dark, it never gets blinded. I mean, there are all these obvious ways where the machine does the job better than a human would. Now, here's the problem. The single most common occupation held by an American man is to drive a car, bus, or truck. That is the single most widespread occupation in the United States. So what are these people going to do? That reality that we have not completely confronted and completely grappled with is one of the central dynamics of this new world that I'm describing. Now, in order to understand what to do about it, we have to recognize what is stirring as a result of it. If you look around the world today, what is striking to me in an age of technology and globalization, that the most powerful force is the return of identity, the return of nationalism in large parts of the world, whether you look at Russia, China, Turkey, India. If you look at Western Europe, in almost every Western European country, you are seeing a decided shift toward a nationalist, populist right. And of course, the best, simplest way to understand Donald Trump is as part of this international phenomenon. The extraordinary success of Donald Trump is that he has been able to run in a party that was defined ever since Ronald Reagan as an internationalist, free trade, free market, open borders party. He has run as a nationalist, populist, protectionist, xenophobe, and of the 17 candidates, he won. Right? That it tells you something about there is a discontent out there. There is a backlash out there that he has been able to very effectively capitalize on. And he recognized, perhaps as a good businessman, seeing his customer, he recognized that the Republican Party out there was not actually that interested in entitlement reform, in flat taxes, in the ending of inheritance duties. What they were interested in hearing about was Mexicans, Chinese, Muslims. In other words, they wanted to make sense of what they saw as a world that was being disrupted in 100 different ways, and they wanted to know that it was somebody else's fault. Right? Now, that's the easy answer. That is the demagogic answer. But it is a very effective answer to people who are in distress. And it is, in some sense, the answer that is being provided by right-wing nationalist parties in Europe. And it is the answer that Mr. Putin provides his people when he explains why he has to do what he has to do. And it is the argument that the Chinese government is providing when it finds itself in trouble. It's even an argument, being made in Japan, where you have a more nationalist prime minister in Japan than you've had for decades and decades. Everywhere you are finding the return of this force that people had often thought was antiquated, was irrational. And if you dial back to the first part of what I was talking about, the one place where you don't see nationalism is the Middle East, but that's because the national project is so fragile that instead what has happened is people have delved down deeper and found deeper senses of identity, but they are all looking for some sense of identity, for some security, some force that can anchor them in a world that they see as being enormously disruptive. Now, I have a generally optimistic bent of mind. I tend to think that at the end of the day, the forces of globalization, of technology, which are forces of integration, they're forces of growth, they're forces of technological progress, are more powerful than the backlash against them. What we are witnessing is an extraordinary era in human productivity. If you think about what I was just saying about the supercomputer in every pocket, and you ask yourself what that will mean for human potential, it's extraordinary. I'll give you one final example just to illustrate why one can still be very hopeful. You look at a country like India. India has had basically very little contact so far with the internet because India, for those of you who have been, has pretty crappy infrastructure. And so when you think about the internet, until, for the most part, the internet means broadband, Wi-Fi, that kind of thing. And you just don't have it, except in the big cities for upper middle class people. So 2 years ago, I think it would have been fair to say about 100 million people in India had good internet access. By the end of 2018, 1 billion people in India will have good internet access. Why? Because of smartphones and 4G. You are seeing a revolution of smartphones with 4G blanketing the country, and so that $35 phones are being sold that have very strong 4G, that can access video, they can access the information of the world. Think about what we're talking about. We're talking about 3 times the population of the United States having access to the internet and all the information and knowledge it means. And that means an ecosystem of commerce, that means an ecosystem of empowerment. It's got to be good, right? We believe in human capital. We believe this stuff is important. But we have to remember that we have to address these forces of backlash, of identity, of pushback. And the most important place that they can be addressed is the United States. Because at the end of the day, the United States is the country that has created the world I just described. At the end of World War II, it is the United States that went around the world telling people, break down your barriers, lower tariffs, open yourselves up to trade, open yourselves up to technology, have more participatory politics. In other words, the whole revolution, political, economic, technological, that has been taking place around the world has been powered, championed by the United States. And so my one great fear, however, is that while we've been spreading it all very well around the world, we haven't done so much at home. And that some historian will look back 100 years from now and say, the United States, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, it really managed to achieve its core foreign policy objective. It globalized the world. It just forgot along the way to globalize the United States of America. Thank you all very much. Thank you. All right, questions, comments, disagreements are welcome, but remember, you've got lots of people here, so if you can make sure they're brief and that there is actually a question mark at the end.
First of all, thank you very much for being a voice of reason and all of this complicated stuff. You described the democratization and information from technology, and it seems that is a force that could put things back together, but has been used actually to tear the Middle East to pieces. And it seems that most civil society was originally built in the era before that and was able to graduate up to the new modern technology. I'm curious, how do you think you get from having total destruction and no civil society using this technology as actually a counterweight against you now? How do you graduate up again?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're absolutely right that the technology has, in that context, been a force for disruption and destabilization and atomization, right? It's pulled the country and the social fabric apart. And now you have this reality of chaos. What it really emphasizes, it seems to me, is the importance of politics. That we sometimes tend to think that technology or economics, that they will sort of magically make things happen. But that what happened in these countries is that because you did not have strong political institutions, you did not have strong political parties, that what you ended up with is the atrophy and the erosion of order. And so the only way I think you'll manage to do it is to rebuild some of that political capital, some of those political institutions, some of that political order. The false hope would be a strong man on a horse who comes in and scares everybody, because A, that won't work. I think we live in an age where it's much easier to disrupt. And so it's easier for ISIS to disrupt, it's easier for ISIS's competitors to disrupt. But where you have an actual political project, look at Egypt. Egypt is the one country that went through this disruption but was able to return and recover itself. And I'm not, I don't make any apologies for what is a very dictatorial place, but it's worth interest in understanding from a historical perspective that why was Egypt able to do it? Because Egypt has had a state for 5,000 years with roughly the same borders, the same cities. Cairo has been around for the longest time. And that may have something to do with it. That there is an internal organic order. It is the Pharaoh's state, after all, that was able to reassert its authority. While what happened in the other places is when order was collapsed, there was no political force that could reemerge and reassert itself. So politics is very hard and messy, but it is important. And it's one of the reasons I worry a great deal about the destruction of great political institutions like the Republican Party, to put it in an entirely other context. Yeah.
Good evening. My question will include the Trump word, but I don't want to talk about. I don't want you to talk about
It's
Trump.
It's inevitable. Don't worry.
But you mentioned institutions. Why is it that that political campaign identified this force that has been now talked about and that you described so well, and journalists didn't?
Great question. Why was it that Trump? So I was saying to Steve Denning, the moment for me that crystallized that Trump had a kind of genius was the first debate, 17 people, and they asked, are you in favor of entitlement reform, cutting Social Security and Medicare? Now, you understand, it is an article of faith in the Republican Party that the way you assert your manhood is by saying that you're in favor of cutting Social Security. And Trump says, no, I'm not going to cut Social Security and Medicare. Why? Because he just looked at his audience, I think, and noticed they're all old people. He said, why would they want to cut Social Security and Medicare? Now, so what was happening behind the scenes is that the Republican Party is funded by a very, very powerful group of people. And it's not just, I don't mean this in narrow self-interest terms, but who genuinely believe in a certain kind of very free market economics, limited government. And in that bubble, it was very important to demonstrate your willingness to say something tough and hard and stern and unpopular. And they convinced themselves, frankly, that everybody agreed with them. I think that one of the things we've realized is that the Republican Party is not that conservative. Because look, there were 17 people running for the nomination. The least conservative man won. Right? So there was something that there was a disjuncture there, and the media probably was too busy covering the funders, the donors, the think tanks that they don't, the ideologists of the Republican Party, and not actually going out into the country and talking to these people who are actual living, breathing Republicans. And I think frankly, we all made that mistake. The media made the mistake. And of course, most importantly, these 16 other candidates who are running against Donald Trump made that mistake. But here's what I worry about. Whatever happens to Donald Trump, people will not forget that he identified that and was successful at it, and that market is out there. And politics is very much like free market economics. Once you notice a market, people will go. Where there is a demand for a certain kind of politician, there will be a supply. So Donald Trump will not be the last populist, nationalist, protectionist candidate, isolationist candidate we will see.
Thank you very much for your comments. You sort of mentioned the rise of right-wing nationalist parties in Europe, and then drew some parallels to what's happened in the United States presidential election, or primary so far. What differences do you see in what's happened in Europe and what you see happening in the United States today?
It's a great question. I think that, look, I'm an immigrant to the United States, so I think fundamentally the United States will overcome this. We will not go down a path of the kind of angry, xenophobic nationalism that is potentially the danger in a place like France. I think America has, the actual facts are that the United States has done a very good job assimilating immigrants. It has done an extremely good job assimilating Mexican immigrants. It has done a very good job assimilating Muslim immigrants, much better than European countries. And I think that the more people, we go through paroxysms of fear and paranoia and things like that, but then we come to our senses. And I don't believe that the United States will go down a path like this permanently, whereas in Europe I do worry. American nationalism is fundamentally defined by ideas. As long as you subscribe to the ideas, you are an American, right? In France, for example, nationalism is a more blood and soil thing. We've been in these forests for 1,000 years, and that's what defines us as a nation. Well, what do you do with the guy who came from Algeria last week, right? How does he fit into that conception of nationalism? That's the problem Europe has, and it's not an easy problem to solve. It's not easy to suddenly say, oh, we're also a ideas-based nationalism when you haven't been that for 1,000 years. So I think that's the big difference. America has an easy path out, and it has a path which is to just preach what it's practicing. If you look on the ground, there's this great article by James Fallows in The Atlantic, where he goes around 2 or 3 dozen cities in America, small cities like Sioux Falls and places like that. And he asks them, what do you think is going on in America? And they say, oh my God, the country is collapsing, falling apart, totally on the wrong track. And he says, what do you think is happening in Sioux Falls? Oh, we're doing great. We're assimilating the immigrants. We've found new training opportunities. We're raising a bond issue for the school system. And I think that's the reality in America is Tocqueville's great observation. Most of the progress is bottom up. But the danger is we have people at the top who are trying to give energy to these ideas of divisiveness. And look, it's a seductive thing to be told, right? To be told, your life sucks and it's not your fault. It's the fault of some, Mexicans and Muslims and Chinese. And Trump goes on about the Japanese, which is a kind of bizarre, I think it comes from the time, he came to power in the 1980s in New York, and everyone thought Japan was going to take over the world. Somebody needs to tell Mr. Trump that Japan has been in quasi-recession for 27 years now. That they really don't need to worry. Of all the countries that are going to take over the world, Japan is not on the top of that list. So.
I love your presentation of the problem. I'd like to hear a little more about your opinions about the solutions, in particular, whether or not you think the universal basic income is a good idea.
Universal basic income, it's a very intriguing idea, because if you take the logic of machine learning and neural networks further and further, and you say to yourself, increasingly the work that lawyers do. For example, what do young lawyers do a lot of? They do a lot of discovery. What is discovery? It's searching documents. Now, who's going to be better at that? A 25-year-old kid working at 2 a.m. in the morning on 6 cups of coffee, or a machine? And if you look at a lot of what doctors do, doctors' diagnosis, a good article, a good doctor can hold 300 or 400 articles in his head. The Watson, the IBM computer, looks at hundreds of thousands of articles within a few minutes. So you start going down that path, and you say to yourself, there's an awful lot of this stuff that machines can do. But then you, I think, have to think about it from terms of the upside. There's a lot of the stuff human beings didn't want to do. You didn't want to memorize 400 articles. You didn't want to spend, years and years of your life searching through documents for specific taglines and words. So is it possible that it frees us up to do things that are uniquely human, that are about social interaction and human interaction and emotional interaction and creativity, that it allows you to expand that sphere of what is genuinely, distinctively human, and let the machines do the copying. Let the machines do the routine stuff. But for that to work, you need some political construct, probably like a universal basic income, where you recognize, look, the society is going to generate lots of wealth. We're going to have a great deal of difficulty figuring out how to distribute it. I have a friend of mine who's a libertarian who says, well, whatever we came up with this idea, we take 50% of the GDP and we distribute it, and that gives everybody $20,000 if you do the math, $20,000 guaranteed annual basic income, and say the other 50% of GDP is a pure free market with no government involvement at all. It should satisfy the libertarians and people worried about it's of course the kind of idea that will never happen, but it gets at, I think, something we have to start thinking about, which is if we are going to find ourselves in this kind of accelerated automation era, how do we make it an opportunity, not a threat?
Within the past few days, Turkish Prime Minister Mehmet Davutoglu was, he resigned from office, which some analysts has clarified as a potential push of power from Recep Erdogan, the president. With Erdogan solidifying some of his powers in the past few years, how do you view Turkey's role in the Middle East in the next few years and its role in the global sphere in the next couple decades?
So looking at Turkey is actually a very interesting way of understanding our own mistaken prisms, okay? When Erdogan came to power, if you remember, he comes from a kind of conservative party that has an Islamist background. Everybody in the West was absolutely paranoid that he was going to turn Turkey into Iran. And that the whole prism through which we looked at him was really Iran, theocracy, how is he going to, these were all the dangers that we kept looking at. It turns out he's not so much an Islamic theocrat as a regular elected autocrat. His model was not Iran, it was Putin's Russia. He was trying to accumulate power, get rid of political opposition, silence the press, find ways to rule in an unobtrusive fashion. And if we had been more attentive to that danger, at a time when Turkey was much more susceptible to influence, I think we would have had a much greater impact on him. Remember, Turkey is, in miniature, encapsulates the story I was telling of the rise of the rest. 30 years ago, the Turkish economy was a basket case economy, constantly bailed out by the World Bank and by the United States, ruled by generals. And so when the United States said to them, jump, they only asked how high, right? Today, the Turkish economy has quadrupled in size. It is a consolidated political system which is mostly democratic with a very powerful popular leader, most powerful popular leader since Ataturk, the founder of Turkey. When Washington says jump, he doesn't even listen. When Europe says jump, he doesn't even listen. So part of the challenge in this new world is you have these new realities of countries you can't influence that much. Turkey is going down a path that I think is very worrying. Again, not so much Islamism. There's actually been almost no legislated Islamism in Turkey, but there has been a great deal of legislated and unlegislated usurpation of power, the destruction of the press, the elimination or sidelining of political features that make up a society of checks and balances. And one hopes it doesn't happen because Turkey has been this extraordinary shining light in the world of Islam. And it's still worth pointing out, it still retains much of that democratic character, though, it gets less and less every 6 months. So I think we're going to have to make this the last. I'm so sorry.
I really relate, and thank you for your comment about we've done a lousy job of selling globalization at home. Even on your show on Sunday and talking about trade with China, you talked about the downside, jobs moving overseas, the upside being inexpensive products here, without talking about the fact that all those dollars have to come back to this country and create jobs here. They're companies all over this state that are financed with dollars from China and their products bought over here, and nobody talks about that or finds the people that are benefiting from the dollars coming back. How can we do a better job of selling that?
No, so when Donald Trump talks about the trade deficit, what, and this now gets into economics, and most people, their eyes start to glaze over, but the logical converse of the trade deficit is the investment surplus that comes into the United States, which is huge. And he keeps talking about how he's get people to invest in America. People are investing in America. That's why we have a trade deficit. That's why we have all this money of people coming, sending money into the United States. And it's very difficult to explain that. And it's actually very unusual for a country which has an extraordinary pool of capital itself to attract this much capital from the rest of the world. But when you attract that much capital from the rest of the world, you kind of have to buy something. And what we've tended to do is buy cheap Chinese junk. So be it. There are probably other choices. But the point is that what you're trying to get at is the complicated mesh-like two-way street that globalization is. It's very difficult to explain. And the reason is because the costs are shallow and distributed across the country. We all benefit from, it's like everyone getting a tax cut. Lower costs of goods, services, lower costs of food, lower costs of travel. But you don't say thank you, China, when that happens. You don't say thank you, India. But when you see a factory go out of work and you hear that the people are being sent to Mexico, or the factory is being sent to Mexico, that's one factory, one town. And this is the problem with the American political system in general. We respond to concentrated, narrow interests. People often talk about majority rule. My fear is in America sometimes we don't have majority rule. We have minority rule. Angry, aggrieved, concentrated minorities who send 20 emails a day to their congressman, and you guys don't, right? And so guess whose voice gets heard? And when you hear about why gun legislation, why gun control doesn't pass, or why you have these extraordinary efforts to disenfranchise people in the southern states that is still going on. We're extraordinary. It's because there are people who care, and it's a smaller segment of people, but they care deeply and passionately, and they are the ones who send the 10 emails a day. And then there are all of us who kind of feel like, we've got other things to do with our lives. And we've got to do something about that, because I really do think that American democracy is right now going to go through its very difficult test. And if the vast majority does not mobilize and speak up with the kind of passion for these goods that we hold in common, these values that we hold, and the idea of an optimistic view of the world, there is a great danger, because the fundamental misconception I think that people have out there, and it's because it's been peddled by politicians for so long, is that the United States is in some kind of deep structural economic, political, and cultural decline, which to me looks like a kind of fantasy land when you look at it from any other country in the world. We're growing 50% faster than Europe. We're growing 4 times faster than Japan. If you look around the world, emerging markets are in trouble. The United States is politically stable, is economically dynamic. It does not have any big bubbles as it did in the past, whether it's in housing, whether it's in other areas. I realize saying that in Silicon Valley is a more difficult reality. But the fundamental truth about the United States is we dominate the world of technology, which is the emerging industries of the future. We are demographically vibrant in a way that very few rich, advanced countries are. We take in, forget all the talk you hear about illegal immigration, we take in 1 million legal immigrants a year. That's more than the rest of the world put together. And that provides an incredible vital source of energy to this country. We have transformed the energy market so that the United States is essentially energy independent. And you have, now I'm going to say something crazy that you're going to think is too Pollyannish, but we have pretty good government. By which I mean, local government in the United States, which is what most government is, actually functions very well. If you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, I would argue that cities and states, by and large, are better run today than they've been in the past. The old system was patronage, corruption, crazy left-wing politics. Today, it's much more technocratic, evidence-based. You think about Garcetti in LA, you think about Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, you think about Bloomberg in New York, you think about most of the major cities, they're being run in that fashion. As for Washington, look, here's my one saving grace about Washington. The world went through a near-death experience in 2008, 2009, right? And you had an interesting social science experiment. Around the world, different countries had to respond. And I think it's absolutely clear the US responded the best to the great crisis and recession, and we came out of it because we responded best. Because we fired on all cylinders, we did fiscal, monetary, reform and recap of the banking sector, everything. If you would have written a story and said, let's make up a scenario where we really test the American political system, what would be the worst time to get America to do big, controversial, difficult things? You'd say, oh, let's make it in the last year of an unpopular president, and let's have all the crucial decisions actually take place in the lame duck period, when the president has been elected but not inaugurated. That's when all this stuff happened. It was, Barack Obama's incoming administration and George W. Bush's outgoing administration with Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner working together that managed to do all this stuff. So, that's extraordinary. Now you say, okay, that's in deep crisis mode. But after that, we've been in gridlock and paralysis. To which I think sometimes maybe the founding fathers wanted exactly that, which was every now and then American government in Washington springs to life, rescues the world, and then slumbers back into gridlock and deadlock so that it can't do very much. And maybe in its own way, that is the genius of the American system. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.